Why did it take Odysseus 10 years to return home? The Trojan War was finally over. After 10 years of bloodshed, the Greeks had won. The Trojan horse plan had worked, the city had fallen, and the soldiers had boarded their ships to return home. For most of them, the war was over. But for one man, the real adventure was only beginning. His name was Odysseus. Today, we remember him as the brilliant king who came up with the idea of the Trojan horse. But most people do not know why it took him another 10 years to reach home. Many people assume Poseidon was the only reason. The truth was far more complicated. The gods made his journey difficult, but some of his own mistakes made every disaster worse. And that is why Odysseus's journey home became one of the most famous adventures in history. Odysseus's home was the island of Ithaca. His wife, Penelope, and his son, Telemachus, were waiting for him. Under normal circumstances, the journey home might have taken only a few months. But things began to go wrong at the very first stop. Odysseus and his men raided the city of the Cicones, who had been allies of Troy. They should have taken their spoils and left immediately. Odysseus told them to do exactly that, but his men refused to listen. Let's stay a little longer. Let's collect a little more treasure. That greed came at a terrible price. The Cicones gathered warriors from the surrounding area and launched a counterattack. Odysseus escaped, but he lost many of his men before the journey had truly begun. The first lesson had already been delivered. Sometimes, refusing to stop after a victory is where disaster begins. Sometime later, they reached a mysterious island. The people who lived there offered them lotus fruit. Anyone who ate it forgot about home. Some of Odysseus's men ate the fruit and changed immediately. They no longer wanted to return to Ithaca. They only wanted to remain on the island and keep eating lotus. Odysseus forced them back onto the ships. Because sometimes, the thing that pulls a person away from the road is not danger, it is comfort. But the true disaster came soon afterward. Odysseus and his men entered a huge cave. Inside, they found cheese, containers of milk, and flocks of sheep. His men wanted to take the food and leave. But Odysseus wanted to meet the owner of the cave. That decision changed everything. When evening came, the owner returned. A giant cyclops with a single eye. His name was Polyphemus, and he was the son of Poseidon. The giant sealed the entrance of the cave with an enormous rock. Then he grabbed 2 of Odysseus's men and killed them. Odysseus immediately thought about killing the giant, but he stopped himself. Because if he killed Polyphemus, no one would be able to move the rock blocking the entrance. So instead, he made a plan. He gave the giant the powerful wine he had brought with him. When Polyphemus became drunk, he asked Odysseus for his name. And Odysseus gave one of the cleverest answers in history. My name is Nobody. Once the giant fell asleep, Odysseus and his men drove a burning stake into his single eye. Polyphemus screamed in agony. The other Cyclopes called from outside. Who is attacking you? The giant answered. Nobody. The others assumed he was suffering from some kind of illness, so they left without helping him. The next morning, Odysseus tied his men beneath the sheep and escaped from the cave. They were finally safe. But just as they were sailing away, Odysseus made a terrible mistake. His ego took control. He shouted loudly enough for the giant to hear. It was not Nobody who did this. It was Odysseus, king of Ithaca. Polyphemus looked toward the sky and prayed to his father, Poseidon. Do not let this man return home easily. And that was the exact moment Odysseus's 10-year nightmare began. Sometime later, they met Aeolus, the lord of the winds. Aeolus trapped every violent storm inside a leather bag and gave it to Odysseus. No matter what happens, do not open this bag, he warned. Days later, Ithaca was finally visible in the distance. Odysseus, exhausted, fell asleep. His men assumed the bag was filled with gold. Out of curiosity, they opened it. Every wind burst free at once. A violent storm drove the ship back into the open sea. They had almost reached home. Now they had to begin all over again. Later, the giant Laestrygonians attacked them. They destroyed almost every ship. Only Odysseus's vessel remained. Then they reached the island of the sorceress Circe. Circe transformed the men into pigs. But Hermes gave Odysseus a magical plant that protected him from her spell. Odysseus resisted the magic and rescued his companions. But even there, they remained for an entire year. The journey grew longer once again. Circe told Odysseus that before he could return home, he first had to travel to the land of the dead. There, he met the prophet Tiresias. Tiresias gave him one important warning. Do not touch the sacred cattle of Helios, otherwise everyone would die. Later, they reached the waters of the Sirens. The Sirens' voices were so beautiful that anyone who heard them steered directly toward the rocks and died. Odysseus wanted to hear their song. He sealed his men's ears with wax. Then he ordered them to tie him tightly to the mast. When the Sirens began to sing, he begged to be released. But his men could not hear him, so they refused to untie him. And so, Odysseus became the first person to hear the song of the Sirens and survive. One final obstacle stood ahead. Scylla and Charybdis. On one side was a terrifying monster with 6 heads. On the other was a massive whirlpool capable of swallowing entire ships. Odysseus chose the route near Scylla because he knew it would cost fewer lives. The monster seized and killed 6 of his men. But the rest of the ship survived. At last, they reached the sacred island of Helios. Odysseus warned his men again and again, "Do not touch the cattle." But his starving men refused to listen. They slaughtered the animals. In response, Zeus sent a terrible storm. The ship shattered. Every one of Odysseus's companions died. Odysseus was the only survivor. The waves carried him to the island of Ogygia. A goddess named Calypso lived there. Calypso fell in love with him and refused to let him leave for 7 years. Eventually, Athena intervened. By the command of Zeus, Odysseus was finally released. Years later, he reached the shores of Ithaca. But this time, no one recognized him. Athena disguised him as an old beggar. Odysseus silently watched the suitors who had taken over his palace. Then, at last, he revealed his identity. With the help of his son, Telemachus, he reclaimed his palace and reunited with his family after 20 years. So why did it take Odysseus 10 years to return home? Because the gods were not the only forces standing in his way. Greed, curiosity, impatience, and most importantly, his own pride. Every bad decision made the journey a little longer. Perhaps that was the most important lesson Homer wanted to leave behind. Sometimes, the thing that pulls a person away from the destination is not fate, it is their own choices. This was just one of history's biggest flops. Subscribe to History Flops for more. See you in the next one.